It's also going to give you a hint as to what you're going to see and the type of stagecraft that you're going to see.
The thing that's really sort of extraordinary about Hamilton and sets him apart from the other founding fathers, that he's the one that came from somewhere else. John Adams can trace his line all the way back. George Washington had a certain amount of land. Jefferson was very wealthy. Franklin, like Hamilton, sort of came up from humble beginnings, but was one of the more famous inventors and minds of our generation, and got himself to a very comfortable spot by the time Hamilton came along. Hamilton really rose on his wits and his intelligence. He's the proof among the founders that America can be a meritocracy, and that if you're smart enough and you work hard enough, you can rise in this country. In that way, he's the proto-immigrant story, and it's both poignant and beautiful to realize that Hamilton saw us as a United States before our founders did. We were 13 colonies in an alliance against a British overlord, and Hamilton's financial plan of assuming our debts and making all of that run through one central agency was the notion of thinking of us as one nation. There was people would say to Madison, are you going to vote for Hamilton's plan, or are you your country's man? And by your country, they meant Virginia. Parochial interests abounded, local interests abounded, and Hamilton's the one who, sometimes through brute force, sometimes through economic self-interest, got us beyond that to all thinking as one nation. And that's because he didn't have a nation to claim as his own. He came here, and this was his adopted nation. A lot of the other founders got to travel. Jefferson spent a famous amount of time in Paris, as did Franklin. Hamilton was like a lifer. He spent his time in New York and Philly, and that was it. So he's also our proto-immigrant and our proto-New Yorker.
All right, so there's a couple things that Miranda mentions there that I really like, and I think that's going to kind of be the theme of what I talk about today. That this guy, he's different than everybody else, and I think what we're going to find is not a lot of people liked Alexander Hamilton when he was alive. The sort of the celebration of his life is something fairly new. A lot of people didn't like him. We'll talk a little bit about that this evening. A list of people who don't like Alexander Hamilton, right? And that list is fairly lengthy, right? I'm just going to highlight a few people. But I think what separates him is, yes, he's different. Right? He's not coming from means. He's a self-made man. And in a world where there's a lot of talk of equality, those words are coming out of the mouths of people who are not necessarily living it, who are not coming from a world of equality. And honestly, I think if we had to put them to the ringer, I think they wouldn't necessarily be in favor of a true equal system. And then here comes this Hamilton guy. He's a loudmouth. He's sort of obnoxious. He's incredibly brash and arrogant. But more than that, he's different. He doesn't come from means, and there's something that's inherently untrustworthy with him. Right? That was Jefferson's big issue with him. He's not an American. He's from the Caribbean. He's from some wild island area. You know, that's not the sort that we're looking at for leadership here. But the thing that always strikes me about Hamilton, and Miranda got into that a little bit, is that he's playing a game where he's playing 5 steps ahead. You know, he is looking at what the United States will be at a time when he's surrounded by individuals who are stuck on what the United States is. You know, and we look at a lot of his ideas now, and we say this guy had it all figured out. At that time, it was that arrogance that really cost him friends, and eventually it's going to cost him his life. All right? So that's kind of what I want to focus. What makes this guy's life so different and his rise to power so remarkable? What I'm going to use up here, I just wanted to give you some images. You know, there's a lot of names that you're going to hear in the songs, a lot of names that you hear on stage, like Hercules Mulligan. You know, I can promise you that Hercules Mulligan does not get talked about in any U.S. history class unless somebody is determined to give you the most finite detail of American history. And yet, he's a starring figure in this show. So I want us to know who these people are. We're going to hear about them in song and on stage. I want to know who these people are. And, you know, it makes for, I think, an interesting comparison to the actual actors. I can guarantee you that everybody I flash up here is going to be white. But not a lot of the actors on the stage are. So think about that when you think about what Miranda said, that history is told through the eyes of the storyteller. You know, and he admits that he's got a goal in mind when he put this play together. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. But I think when we see and we hear all these things, we got to know who these people really are. All right. So, jumped all the way to Eliza. We're not ready for Eliza yet. All right, we're going to start here. All right. So Hamilton is born in 1755 or 1757. It's one of the two. Okay. All right. If you ask those who felt like they knew him, it was 1757. But at one point, Alexander Hamilton actually wrote out sort of an indentured contract for himself, and he put down 1755. So what do we go with? I don't know. But I sort of trust the man to know the year he was born. So I guess for the sake of things, we will call it 1755. Right? Where is he born? He's born here. You know, you look outside, you see where we're living. This is where he's born. It's a Caribbean island called Nevis. If you get down there into the Leeward Islands, St. Kitts and Nevis is the name of the country now, but it's beautiful. But that's where he's born, and that's where he's going to live until he's 8 years old. Now, one of the things that drove Hamilton throughout his entire life was this inner desire, this need to prove himself. You know, and I don't think that that's something that everybody has. That's something that develops within you. Where does that come from? A lot of that comes from, you know, kind of his background and the situation that he's born into. It's enough to tell you, John Adams once referred to Alexander Hamilton as the bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. And that's what people like John Adams are saying about this guy. So where does that idea of illegitimacy come in? Well, the story there, his mom, Rachel, was married to a guy who was considerably older than her. It was an arranged marriage, and she didn't want to be a part of it from the very beginning. First chance she got out of that house. It didn't help that her husband was constantly having affairs on her. And she ended up leaving town and getting away from this guy. Now, he didn't chase after her, but he also didn't like the idea of his wife thinking that she could just run away whenever she wanted. So he sort of let her go until he found out that A, her family had a little bit of money, and B, that she was considering marrying somebody else. So her first husband actually has her arrested. And it's all based around this charge in that region where the man, the adulterer, if that was the man, could divorce the wife and yet still claim all of her assets. It's a pretty raw deal, to be sure. So he works it up for her to be arrested for the charge, and this is the charge literally in the islands, of whoring And she's thrown in a prison on Nevis for that crime. And she's going to be there. She's going to be there for a while. She's there for several months by herself in a Caribbean prison. She finally gets herself out. She manages to secure a divorce from this guy, thank goodness. And she falls in love with this guy, James Hamilton, Alexander's father. Alexander has an older brother, right? They've got these two kids, but there's still some concern as to whether or not the Hamilton and Rachel marriage is legal. So there's where you start to get this talk that Hamilton is, he's a bastard, that he's illegitimate, and his brother as well, and that's a stigma that sort of gets attached to him. They eventually do marry, but it's probably more like a common law marriage. But that's the atmosphere that he's raised in. When Alexander Hamilton is just a young boy, his father leaves his wife and just moves to the next island. I mean, he doesn't vanish. He just moves to the next island. And Hamilton continues to have contact with him throughout the duration of his life. So, I mean, it's sad that here he is, his dad's left, but it's not like he's just gone. He's just on the next island. And, I mean, that's the extent of it. He's stuck with his mother. He's got an older brother and his mom. His mom decides this isn't working for us. Let's move to St. Croix. And, I mean, I think this maybe tells us a little bit where Hamilton gets it from. She buys a storefront and opens up basically a trading post. She makes a nice little living for herself. Her and her two sons live above the store, and everything seems to maybe be working out at this point. But then a fever hits St. Croix, and both Alexander and his mom come down sick. Alexander lives, but as the soundtrack tells us, mom dies. Right? So here he is. He's, 11 years old. And he's, I mean, for all sakes and purposes, an orphan. He's got this stigma of being illegitimate attached to him. What happens now? He gets sent to live with a cousin on another part of the island. He's there for about a year, and the cousin commits suicide. Okay? This man's early life is pretty wild. And at that point, I think we could safely say it looks pretty bleak for Hamilton. But thankfully, he is saved by a couple of guys named David Beekman and Nick Kruger. And they opened up a store right here on St. Croix. These were really rich guys. They were active in the triangular trade of the region. They also operated a store in New York City. And they came into contact with Alexander Hamilton through a guy named Hugh Knox. Right? Hugh Knox was basically a preacher living on St. Croix. And he started talking, getting to know this Hamilton kid, could immediately tell this kid was pretty bright. And Hugh Knox is the guy that went to Beekman and Kruger and said, you got to hire this guy as an apprentice, as a clerk. And so they do, and almost immediately, Hamilton starts showing incredible skill with mathematics, with organization, and he apparently was good enough that we can find record that Beekman and Kruger just left one day. They were gone for almost a year, and they left a 14-year-old Alexander Hamilton to run their entire business. Right, that's pretty impressive. And that's where, we start talking about Hamilton being sort of a financial genius. There's no doubt that this is where that is born. Right? So one day when he's 14 years old, a hurricane, and I mentioned this with Irma coming through, a massive hurricane sweeps through St. Croix and levels a good part of the island. I mean, Hamilton survives, but this is a devastating storm. And so Hamilton decides to write a letter to his father. I'm going to send that letter around now, where he basically tells his father the story of this hurricane. And I think it's important that you guys be able to get your hands on it because it's just something else. And there is enough copies for Mrs. Rutherford to have one, so make sure she gets one of these. Right? But if you get a chance, look at some of this writing. What happens here is his old buddy Hugh Knox happens to find a copy of this letter laying out on Hamilton's desk at work. And he starts reading. And he's blown away, no pun intended. by the, you get it, sorry. Anyway, all right, yeah. So he's blown away by this guy's writing ability. He's 14 years old. It's just this crazy writing. And if you get a chance, let's take a look at this. All right, guys, just some parts of this. How he describes this hurricane. I just watched Al Roker describe it, and it wasn't near as good. So remember, he's writing to his father here. He's writing to his father. So notice how he addresses him. It's not like, what's up, Dad? Honored sir, I take up my pen just to give you an imperfect account of one of the most dreadful hurricanes that memory or any records would ever can trace. And then he goes on to kind of just give a basic description of it. It began about dusk from the north, raged violently until 10 o'clock, and then you can just see he starts getting into it. It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. Like all of nature was dissolving because of this hurricane. Right? The roaring of the sea and the wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air. I don't know what that's about. The crash of falling houses, the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into angels. Oh, okay. This must have been quite a storm. And that's not even the best part of it. You guys can read on further, where then he gets down here, he says, here are my reflections on this melancholy occasion. And then he starts like, he's waxing on like Shakespeare here. Where now, O vile worm, is all thy boasted fortitude and resolution? It's something else. All right? You get a chance. Make sure you read this. All right? Goes on here, a couple of my favorite parts. Death comes rushing on in triumph, veiled in a mantle of tenfold darkness. So the storm was bad, people were dying. But we can't say that. Right? We have to say that death comes rushing on in triumph. It's great stuff. One of my favorite parts is the end. He's gone through this whole thing. Yet hold, O vain mortal, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end he says, our general. See that at the very end. That is referring to a guy named Ulrich Rothschild, who is the governor general of the island of St. Croix. It says, our general has issued several very salutary and humane regulations, and both in his public and private measures has shown himself the man. The man. I love that. I love that description. But, I thought it was important you guys get your hands on this because there's a part in the play where there's a song called Wrote My Way Out. There's a little bit of it here on the timeline. I think it's actually up there maybe with the hurricane. Yeah. The hurricane letter, 1772. All right. What happens here is Hugh Knox finds this letter laying on Hamilton's desk, reads it, he's blown away, and he decides to just pick it up and publish it in the newspaper on the island, the Royal Danish American Gazette. And this is, they got that lyric there. He put a pencil to his temple, connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. I mean, that's one of the themes here is that Hamilton basically writes his way off of this island. Okay, this is published anonymously. Right? It is not published as, Alexander Hamilton. I want to write this. It was published as the story of a late hurricane by a youth of this island to his father, the copy of it which fell by accident into the hands of a gentleman who, being pleased with it himself, showed it to others, to whom it gave equal satisfaction. By the way, this is all the title of it. And who all agreed that it might not prove entertaining to the public. So no name here, no Alexander Hamilton name here. Hugh Knox keeps his name off of it. But, people start calling in and writing into the newspaper saying, who wrote this? This is exceptional. And so then it comes out, this was this Hamilton kid who works for Beekman and Kruger. Right? So Beekman, Kruger, Knox, a couple other guys on the island that have some wealth, raise up money, they stick the kid on a ship, and they send him to the colonies to be educated. Now the plan is he will get trained as a doctor at Princeton, and then he will come back to St. Croix, and he will be the island's doctor. Well, that didn't work. Hamilton got on that boat and never came back. And you know the rest of the story is hilarious. You know, he gets to Princeton, and he walks into Princeton. I was telling this. I think I told the story to my AP Gov group a little bit. He walks into Princeton, which is the foremost college in the states at that time, and it's ran by a guy named John Witherspoon, who's the president of Princeton at the time. Which, by the way, just a little side note here, a quick preview. John Witherspoon became the president, took it over from a guy named Aaron Burr, Sr. Right? So there's a connection there. So Witherspoon's the president. Witherspoon is kind of a big deal. This guy will sign the Declaration of Independence. And Hamilton walks in and sits down with Witherspoon, shows him his papers. These are my sponsors. Okay, sounds good. Let's talk about what you're going to focus on here. And Hamilton says, no. I know what I'm doing. I know that typically it's 3 years to get my degree. That isn't going to work for me. So I'm going to do everything in 2 years. And I'm going to run this just on my own schedule. Right? I'm going to kind of just do this whole thing as like an independent study. So as soon as I'm done with the class, I'm just moving on to the next one. None of this like semester crap. Right? I'm just going to do it all at the same time. And Witherspoon says, no. And part of the reason why Witherspoon was like so nervous to let Hamilton do it, I don't know that it was an insult to Hamilton's ability. It's because a year prior, they had a kid graduate in 2 years, and upon graduation had a nervous breakdown. And he was worried that Hamilton would do the same thing. By the way, that kid who had that nervous breakdown, his name was James Madison. Right. So, Hamilton can't get into Princeton now, so he ends up going to New York, where he lands at King's College. I think that's important, guys. Hamilton doesn't, I don't know if we call it grow up, but he doesn't grow up in Philadelphia. He doesn't grow up in Boston. These are cities that were founded as religious experiments. Boston was the city on a hill. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Religion was still key there. So Hamilton ends up in New York. And in New York, the religion was the almighty dollar, or pound, I suppose, at that time. All right, that city was founded on money, and it remained that way the whole time through. That's where Hamilton's going to get his education. He enrolls at King's College, which today would be known as Columbia. And to this day, he is considered Columbia's most famous graduate. They have a giant statue of him. He never graduated from Columbia. They just really like the guy, I guess. But the reason why he doesn't graduate is because the revolution starts. And Hamilton is caught up in this. He gives this famous speech in one of the New York squares. And, this gets him wrapped up in this fervor. He meets a guy named Hercules Mulligan. Hercules Mulligan was a merchant tradesman at that time, probably Alexander Hamilton's real first true legitimate friend. And Hercules Mulligan was a part of an organization that you might have heard of, called the Sons of Liberty. So he's got these voices in his ears, and they're getting his interest piqued. And so Hamilton he's caught up in this fervor, and he joins the Continental Army. He forms his own New York militia. And by the way, he's been in New York for like a year and a half. But he forms his own militia, and they go off to fight in the war. Now, that militia is eventually going to be, by the way, here's Hercules Mulligan. In the show, he's played by a muscular black man. Hercules Mulligan. So you hear that? I finally, the past 2-3 times I've been in New York, I've been frantically searching for this dude's headstone. And I finally found it. Finally found it on my last trip there. I will talk about it. But the New York militia that Hamilton founds is sort of absorbed into Washington's army. And that puts him into contact with the man himself. And Washington recognizes immediately the brilliance and the potential of this guy and brings him on as an aide-de-camp. And that's where he'll be for the next 5 years. And, they say sometimes a lot of men who lack a father figure, who don't have a father, they go out searching for father figures. They collect them. I don't know if that's true or not, But Hamilton, and I think in a lot of ways, does begin to look at Washington in that light. I know that Washington definitely looked at Hamilton as a son. If you know anything about George Washington, he didn't have any kids of his own. The only children that he had were his wife's children from a previous marriage. So, Hamilton was somebody who was a very kindred spirit, and Washington definitely felt that that sort of familial feeling with Hamilton. Hamilton sort of begins by loving it. He's caught up in the Washington aura like everybody else. But after 5 years, he's really chafing at this position, and he desperately wants a field command. And Washington finally gives it to him at Yorktown, which those of you that have already finished U.S. history know is basically the last battle of the war. But Hamilton and his men are absolutely central to the American victory. So Hamilton emerges from this as a war hero. And he has George Washington as his letter of recommendation. That's a pretty good one. Right? And so he goes back to New York when the war is over. He's finally in a position where he can get married. Now, back in New York was basically ran by two families, the Livingston family and the Schuylers. Right? And this was the patriarch here. Doesn't he look like a little bit like George Washington? That's Philip Schuyler, that's Dad. Now, Philip Schuyler had 5 daughters. 2 of them were considerably younger. 3 that were all fairly close in age, Angelica, Elizabeth, and Margaret, who was better called Peggy. And Hamilton fell in love with all of them. And some of that probably overlapped at times, especially with Angelica. All right, here's Angelica up here. If you start listening to the soundtrack, Angelica was completely head over heels in love with Hamilton too. And she said, there's a great song called Satisfied on the soundtrack, where some of you are nodding your heads, you've heard this. Basically, Angelica saying, the biggest mistake I ever made was introducing Alexander Hamilton to Eliza. All right? And Hamilton had a thing for Angelica for sure, but this is who he fell in love with. And at our next meeting, I'm going to bring some of the love letters that he wrote to Eliza from the battlefield. And what I love about them is that, number one, he tells her in one letter, I'm poor, right? Like, you're talking about marrying me, but I just want to make sure we're clear. I have nothing. And you're the daughter of the wealthiest man in New York. All right? So he's just like, are you good with that? I love the insecurity that comes out of that. This is Alexander Hamilton. He's like, I'm a little nervous that you're not going to like me. And then there's a later letter that he writes where he's like, you haven't written me in like 2 weeks. What's going on? Who are you dating? What's happening here? It's like, it's great. It's just this adolescent insecurity. There's also a great line in that letter where he tells her, my lovely girl, you grow dearer to me every moment. I stole that line, put it on a little necklace for my wife. Yeah, thank you. That's what I was going for. Yeah, thank you. So, all right. So he comes back from the war. He's finally able. He's a war hero now. He becomes a lawyer, marries Eliza, and they start cranking out kids. He has a lot of offspring. It's yeah. All right. By the way, it's worth noting she's almost going to survive until the Civil War. She died. Yeah, she dies in the late 1850s. She moves to D.C. eventually, and she takes a lot of the stuff with her from their home. I'll show you their home here in a little bit. But one of the things that she always carried with her very close was this bust of Hamilton, and she always would go back to it. People that would visit her always said she always would go back, and she just kind of put her hand on his cheek, and she'd say, "I can't wait for death so that I can rejoin my Alexander." She absolutely was just in love with the guy, which is saying something considering some of the crap that Hamilton put her through, namely Maria Reynolds, who we'll meet later. All right, so just I want to wrap things up here real quick. We got about 10 minutes, so I want to try to get you out of here on the hour. Hamilton's a war hero. He's a good buddy to Washington. He's a lawyer. Everybody knows his name now. So he ends up getting elected to the New York legislature, which leads to a post to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. That's where he starts to interact with this guy. Who's this? This is James Madison. Okay, Madison's coming in from Virginia. They couldn't have been more opposite if they tried, but these two became fast friends. They shared one common big bond, and that's they knew that the way that the government was set up in the first United States, the Articles of Confederation, wasn't working. So they were very, very combined in that. And again, some of my AP Gov kids have heard this story, but they were so close that there was a woman who wrote a letter to one of her friends saying that the other day I saw the young Hamilton and the young Madison walking down the street deep in conversation when they came upon a home where their homeowner's wife was in the front yard with a monkey. And Hamilton and Madison were overcome with excitement, ran into the front yard, and started playing with the monkey. And that's just a great mental image. Hamilton and Madison rolling around, playing, two grown men who are like central to the founding governing document of this country. They're rolling around with a pet monkey. You know, it's hilarious stuff. It's sad that they're going to have such a falling out here shortly, but at that time, through the Constitutional Convention, they're quick friends. Now, during the convention, that's really Madison's time to shine. Hamilton is actually quiet, which is remarkable, because he was never quiet. He only gave one speech the whole time. Now, it went for 3 hours, but that was the only speech he gave. This was Madison's time to shine. Hamilton's real shining moment came after the Constitution was passed. Now we have to get it ratified. All the states have to get on board. And Hamilton knows that the state that's probably going to be the hardest is New York, his home state. Okay? So he decides to put out a propaganda campaign. He joins up with his old buddy Jim Madison and this guy, a guy named John Jay, who's another big name at that time. And they start putting out these documents. What were they called? Very good, Federalist Papers. And it's basically, this is the Constitution, and here's why we all ought to get on board. Okay? There is going to be 89 of these when it's all said and done. I want to make sure I got my numbers right. John Jay is going to write 5. Madison is going to write 29, which means Hamilton's going to write 51 of these things. All right? I mean, and he's cranking them out, 8,000 words. And he's just cranking them out day after day, day after day. And that tells you how good of a writer he is. This guy becomes the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, big name, John Jay. He only writes 5 of these things. Why only 5? Because he gets hurt in what is called the doctor's riots. Remember? This is your mother, right? There was this, for those of you that don't know that story, there was a practice in early medicine where if you were a medical student, the only way you could figure out the human body was to practice on cadavers. And so a lot of times people would donate their bodies to these medical schools. But sometimes you ran out of bodies. So, you got to go find them. And so a lot of times these medical students would go out to the graveyard at night, dig up the dead bodies, bring them back and start, surgery. And, oh, there's the knee bone. It really is connected to it. All right? And so as the story goes, this little boy was walking home one day, and he walks past the medical school in New York City, and he looks in the window. The medical students are in there working on a cadaver. And the little boy stops because he thinks the cadaver looks familiar. You see, his mom just died. And so one of the medical students picks up an arm and says, "This is your mom." That's the story. This is the story. And so he hightails it home and tells his dad, I think they've got mom's body. It's awful. So the dad goes to the graveyard, and sure enough, the wife's body is, like, the gravesite's been disturbed. And so he gathers several thousand New Yorkers, and they descend on this medical school. These are the doctor's riots. So somehow, poor John Jay ends up in the middle of this riot and gets beaten up. And when you combine that with his severe rheumatoid arthritis, he can't write anymore. All right, so that puts all the emphasis. I'm sorry, I digress. It's just a great story. Okay, I don't know. All right, so Hamilton manages to get New York on board. It takes him a while, but he gets there, and now he's in position. This is the last part of the story. I mean, he's in a great position here. Constitution is passed. It's time to elect a new president. Everybody knows who it will be, right? GW. Washington gets elected, and he picks his cabinet. Now, cabinet at that time, very small. You had Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. You had a guy named Henry Knox, no relation to Hugh, as Secretary of War. He was a general on Washington's staff during the Revolution. And then you had Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. Those are the only three people in his cabinet. Talk about an all-star cabinet. That's a cabinet. Right? And almost immediately, Hamilton and Jefferson start button heads. They really start button heads. And there's a great part of the soundtrack, the cabinet battles. There's 1, 2, and 3. My favorite's number 3, where they debate the issue of slavery. Madison works his way into that as well. So go back and listen to some of the stuff. But that's really where it starts between Jefferson. We talk about the list of people who don't like Alexander Hamilton. Right at the top of that list is Thomas Jefferson. Remember, Jefferson's a farmer, and that's what he thinks America should be, a country of farmers. Hamilton's coming in talking about banks, talking about factories and manufacturing. Hamilton had this idea of building a town that would just be a factory. It was wild. Right? And Jefferson's like, what is this guy talking about? This guy's not even an American. There was just a real issue there, real butting of heads there. So you'll get some of that, I think, in the show. It comes through pretty clear. Of course, the other big guy who doesn't like doesn't like Hamilton is this guy. That's Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr is a realtor. Sometimes the shoe fits. Now, Burr, talk about, you got Hamilton coming from a woman who was accused of being a whore. Burr, his grandfather was a guy named Jonathan Edwards, who was a leader of the Great Awakening. One of those, if you listen to the soundtrack, you remember the song Wait For It? My grandfather was a fire and a brimstone preacher. Right? That's Jonathan Edwards that he's talking about. Big name. And then he says, my mom was a genius. My father commanded respect. Remember his dad, president of Princeton, which takes more than a smile. So Aaron Burr is a man who's coming in with some big shoes to fill. And he tries. Poor guy, he tries constantly. He runs for governor of New York. He runs for president. And every time he runs for something, comes Alexander Hamilton to just squash that dream. Okay? There's a great little line here. In the election of 1800, it was Jefferson, and Burr was kind of running along with him. Some of you may remember this story. And basically it works out that they tie, right? Jefferson and Burr. So now it's the House of Representatives that will choose. Well, here's Hamilton saying, you got to vote for Jefferson. This guy's no good. He says, all right, when all is said and done, Jefferson has beliefs. Burr has none. Which, by the way, is also in one of the songs. Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. All right, so he's saying, I don't really like this guy, but at least he's a decent man. This guy's just a snake. And people listen to him. That helps to throw the election to Jefferson. Burr becomes vice president. You think he knows that Hamilton's out to get him? Oh, yeah. So he goes home 4 years later, runs for governor of New York. Hamilton steps in again and says, no, you don't want this guy. It's bad news. Burr loses. But even then, no thoughts of a duel. Well, Hamilton and Burr end up at the same dinner party one night. They don't like each other. They're not talking to each other. Hamilton starts run in his mouth, which he tends to do. And he makes an insinuation to some of the people at the party that if Burr ever tries to run for anything again, he's got a whole list of despicable things he can say about it. And there's even a hint that Burr is a little too close with his own daughter, is Theodosia. Now, is there any evidence of that? No. But the problem is that Hamilton uses the word despicable. Now, you can kick me out of the White House, and you can keep me away from being governor, but I will not be called despicable. That's an insult to honor. And at that point, the duel is set. Now, to finish up with on this duel, this will be our last thing for tonight. Don't pack up on me yet, though, because you got a little bit of homework for our next meeting. So there is, right across the river from New York City, is a little place called Weehawken. And Weehawken, at that point, is known for one thing, and that's where the dueling grounds are. You see, it's low land, so if you get there in the morning, it's real foggy, and nobody can see that you're there to shoot each other. Dueling's illegal, so you got to do it in secret. Now, 1 year prior to this, 3 years prior to this, Hamilton's son, Philip, had basically heard somebody, this was a Burr supporter, talking bad about his dad, challenged him to a duel. They met here at Weehawken, and Philip was shot and killed in a duel. And that sort of broke Hamilton. And so I have no doubt that morning, that was in Al Hamilton's mind. You know, I'm standing where my son was killed. My oldest son was killed. And so Hamilton had already made the decision going into it that he was going to, typically in a duel, you didn't shoot to kill. You simply were there to show up and fire a shot. Or worse, you would aim for a leg. You weren't there to kill. You were just there to reclaim your honor. So Hamilton said, I'll show up, but I'm going to waste my shot. And so when they march off their paces, Hamilton turns and fires his shot into the air. At which point Burr shoots right out. The ball enters right here and basically lodges right next to his liver, opening up part of it, which that'd be fatal now, basically. All right. Somehow Hamilton lives until the very next day, but then he passes away. All right. So where I leave you is that you should take from this, hold on, you should take from this a picture of a man who is driven to prove himself and does. I wrote a blog piece a couple months ago, right? I said, I made the argument, Alexander Hamilton, the first to really chase the American dream. And I think that he maybe models that more than anybody, certainly at that time. And Miranda says this immigrant story, Miranda's at the center, that Hamilton's at the center of it. Right? Incredibly driven, very forward-thinking, incredibly bright, great writer, really arrogant, really incapable, I think. I don't know if this was because of his drive. I don't know what this was, but he's really incapable in some cases of playing the game. There's a line in the show. It's from the song "Congratulations." He says, "You know why Jefferson can get away with half the junk he's doing? Because he doesn't jump at every insult." Now, I paraphrase, but he doesn't jump at every insult. That's what you're doing. You're jumping at every single insult. Right? So we're going to leave it there. Here's what I would like for you to do before our next meeting, which is not in the not too distant future. I've got us on next Tuesday. Okay, if you look in your book, here, right here. It's where it says step 2. Everybody see it? Step 2. Okay, you've got 2 primary documents, and it's asking for you to identify some key words. It's asking you to provide a summary of what the author is saying, and it's asking you to restate it. There's just 2 there. One is from a guy named Samuel Seabury. If you've listened to the soundtrack and you've heard the song Farmer Refuted, this is what's going on. This argument between Seabury and Hamilton. Whereas I think at one point Hamilton says, my dog speaks more eloquently than you. All right? That's Hamilton right there. All right? So what I would like for you to do by the time you come in on Tuesday, I want you to read the step 2 page, and then I want you to complete this, just this front and back. Come back in with that done. That's going to buy us a little extra time. When we come back on Tuesday, the focus will go to looking at a few more documents of his. We'll probably talk about Maria Reynolds. Can't get out of here without talking about her. And then, that'll probably take maybe 15 minutes. The rest of the time, we're going to start looking at prepping for this performance piece. So if you want to start thinking about that, that'll help us out as well. All right? Any questions? Guys, I appreciate your commitment. I promise you it's going to be worth it. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow. Be careful going home.
Unless you want to get it. Oh, yeah. We need to. Oh, you know, boyfriend. I will turn the car off. I'm Mr. Hine.
You guys, careful going home.
Like I said earlier,
Oh, okay.
Fine, I'll make it with Mason instead.
The Daniel or
oh, I forgot about that. That's
Do you need the money
for some reason
now?
it
Because
doesn't.
it's in my truck.